Over the weekend, University of Michigan saw commencement, graduation, university-wide graduation, interrupted by protesters, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protesters that stood for the entirety of that graduation. They were not ushered out. They were not kicked out. No, instead, what is done is these protesters have been accommodated. And Columbia University has canceled their university-wide commencement, knowing that they too would be subject to these types of protests. And it has led so many people in my life personally and out there in social, who's behind this stuff? Like, this is organized. This is not springing up overnight. The cops in New York, the NYPD has said this is highly organized. Flyers, funding. And I've had people say to me, well, who's behind it? So let's dive into it. Let's talk about exactly what's happening in these protests. In a Wall Street Journal report, these protests have been in the making for months, through largely the National Students for Justice in Palestine. It has about 300 chapters across the country. It's about 2 decades old, this organization. And starting some months ago, SJP, and in the case of Columbia, a few other organizations like Samidoun, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Samidoun, Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, it's based out of Canada, started organizing teach-ins for the student leaders in Columbia. Now, the reason I tell you that is to know this. These was a 2-hour session with a Samidoun coordinator, Charlotte Cates. She encouraged students to, quote, build an international popular cradle of resistance. This is a recording that's posted here on YouTube. Now, listen to this quote from Charlotte Cates. There is nothing wrong with being a member of Hamas, being a leader of Hamas, being a fighter in Hamas. These are the people that are on the front lines defending Palestine. Now, like I was talking about with Carrie Kupak Urban, I like to add up the elements. I don't like to run to the most extreme characterization as always possible. And I have not been someone who said these protests are pro-Hamas. Anti-Israel, perhaps. This shows you that the organization behind these protests is specifically preaching them a message that is not just anti-Israel, not just about the policies regarding Gaza, but that is pro-Hamas, a terrorist network that conducted the October 7th horrific slaughters. Pro-Hamas in their own words. Still, how did this get organized? Well, the same Wall Street Journal report says the people behind the organization included former Black Panthers from the 1968 protesters, the 1960s protesters and 70s. The students themselves participated in the BLM protests, so that many of the same ones had experience of this just a few years ago. And they were funded, Students Justice for Palestine, by an organization called Westpac, Westchester-based nonprofit led by a guy named Howard Horowitz, Jewish, by the way. Jewish Justice for Peace, or Jewish Voices for Peace. It's another organization. It's fascinating that many of the organizations helping fund these protests are actually Jewish. I don't know what that says when you see a pro-Hamas, clearly anti-Semitic message, part of what you are funding. But the fact that Black Panthers are involved, and former Black Panthers, and these organizations have been organizing for months on campus, it brings to mind the parallels to 1968. Now, a lot of people have talked about this, and Pete Hegseth and I did this off the wall on Fox and Friends this weekend. I want you to just listen to this. In 1968, Lyndon Baines Johnson was running for re-election as the Democratic nominee for president. He was the sitting president in the United States. His approval rating stood at 36%. In 2024, Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee for president. He is the sitting president, and his approval rating sits at 38%. In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy entered the race on the Democratic side to run against Joe Biden. In 2004, RFK Jr. is running against Joe Biden. In 1968, students started protesting across campus in America, largely centered around the war in Vietnam. In 2024, students across the country on college campuses protesting against the war in Israel, against Gaza. against Hamas. In 68, students chanted, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, LBJ has got to go." In 24, they chant, "Genocide Joe." In fact, there was a huge display at one of these universities on top of an American flag of Joe Biden's face. Underneath it said, "Genocide Joe." In 68, the protests were largely at Columbia, or notably at Columbia, and took over physically occupied Hamilton Hall. In 2024, at Columbia, physically occupying Hamilton Hall. In 68, the protests spilled over to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In 2024, the Democratic National Convention is once again in Chicago, and preparations are being made for inevitable protest, including at this point, permitting them some 4 miles away from the convention. In 68, ultimately, LBJ dropped out. Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, ran for president, lost to Richard Nixon. And speculation is constantly centered around, if poll numbers remain like this for Joe Biden, does he drop out? And if the historical parallels maintain, that would be Kamala Harris running for president. But I promised you names. So Westpac, Students for Justice in Palestine. Who is funding these organizations? Well, new reporting shows that one of the major funders for this group is the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation, at one time run by Bill and Melinda Gates, funded by George Soros, funded by the Pritzker family. You know Soros, you know Gates, Pritzker family, Hyatt Hotels fortune, Governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. The Pritzker family helping fund these organizations. By the way, also the Rockefeller brothers are another funder of Students for Justice in Palestine. Who are the Rockefeller brothers? That's a fund. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund is 5 third-generation Rockefeller brothers, John, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, it's like out of Trading Places, and David. It is distinct from the Rockefeller Foundation. It's the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, along with the Tides Foundation, funding much of this. Now, here's what's fascinating. Those same names, those same foundations, those same families funding the Democratic Party, funding Joe Biden. Joe Biden's same funders are funding an uprising that is largely going to hurt and could upend Joe Biden. There are the names. There are the people behind the funding and organization of what you see happening across America on college campuses. And you could soon see, if the parallels hold to 1968, at the Democratic National Convention.